This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hello and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Teider. My guest today is Orenda Fink. Orenda is an American singer, musician, and writer. She started her musical career at the age of 15 when she released her first album with the band Little Red Rocket in 1997. And Little Red Rocket turned into Azure Ray and won international recognition. Orenda became very successful with this band and has been creating music since then in various constellations and produced many, many albums. And she's with us today because she has just published her first memoir, The Witch's Daughter, My Mother, Her Magic, and the Madness That Bound Us. And today, Orenda lives in California and Mojave Desert, and she's a certified Jungian depth coach. I can't wait to hear more about this. Orenda, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I am so much looking forward to our conversation today. What a powerful book you have written. I assure you it's going to be a great support in the healing process of many, many people. And I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
I couldn't put it down. It's quite rare for me to not be able to put the book down, and I was quite spellbound by it. I have to say I was a little haunted by it at certain moments. It made me feel a little guilty that I couldn't put it down because sometimes I feel like I'm looking at a car crash.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was like, I don't want to see these things, but it's important. And it gave me a big epiphany in my own life and my relationship with my mother, who's not with us anymore for the past 8 years. And I had a great relationship with my mom. But coming to my island where my mom's family comes from and which she loved so much, I finally understood what happened, why your book arrived to me at that moment and why it touched me so deeply. And I think it's a big thing for this podcast as well, because I finally, after 4 years of working with women and interviewing women and talking to their mothers, I finally understood that we all have to emancipate ourselves from our mothers at one point in our lives, no matter what the relationship was like. Even if we have very loving relationships like with our mothers, like I did, there are things we have to learn to let go. And boundaries, I'm still putting up boundaries even 8 years after her death and learning that I don't need to carry certain aspects of her life with me. And that was very freeing. Thank you, Orenda, for that.
You're welcome.
How are you feeling now that the book is out?
The book has been out for less than a month. And I would say that the month leading up to the publication and the first month was a pretty wild emotional roller coaster for me. It's interesting, to hear people say things like, that this is like watching a car wreck, it's haunting. I mean, I've had such extreme reactions to the book that it's triggering.
Yes,
to me.
It is.
And I think that a lot of children of narcissistic abusive households or those suffering with childhood trauma could probably relate to that point in their life as an adult where they realize the level of trauma they have endured. Because when it's your parents, you really don't see that. You certainly don't see it in childhood, and you may never actually fully see it because your psyche protects you from it. And that goes deep into adulthood. So getting the reactions has almost been strangely more triggering than writing the book itself.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
But that said, the roller coaster part of that has been that I've also been getting the most affirming messages and conversations in regards to the book people who relate to it in one way or the other. And interesting, like you, even if you have a good relationship with your mother, a lot of people, they do find something universal in the story. But then there are also those, interestingly enough, that I've had a few people say, this is exactly my life.
I can imagine this. I have a very dear friend, and I sent her a few passages from your book because we are talking a lot about her mom and her relationship with mom, which are very, not to your extreme, but very similar, and the dead figure in this whole thing. And it's very interesting how many parallels there are. There's obviously some kind of a blueprint in this kind of relationships. And of course, when you read it on a page, I think it helps tremendously to people going through something like this because they feel they're not alone.
It does. And that is how I felt when I first read The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, which is one of my favorite memoirs, hugely inspirational for me. And I just remember the first, a friend recommended it, and they said, you're going to relate to this book. And it was the first time that I had read anything similar to my childhood, written with such, candor and honesty. And it was really life-changing for me. And ultimately, I think that was the inspiration for me writing my own book.
Yeah.
So there is something, it's healing to read other people's stories, even if they're hard to read. Yeah.
It is. Orenda, now we talked so much about the book, but we didn't actually talk about the book. Let's tell my listeners a little bit about the book and the topic and your struggle, the struggle we're describing.
Yes, so the book is called The Witch's Daughter, and it has a double meaning wherein my mother was a self-professed witch in the American South. And I wouldn't say she was exactly a good witch. She really had no problem going to the dark side. And I think she saw her witchcraft as a sense of power for her and mostly revenge, very vengeful magic. And I think that ties into what I understood later, which is really, I think, the focal point of the book is understanding that my mother had undiagnosed borderline personality disorder. And I came to that conclusion through therapy, but even more than that, a big fight that my mother and I had during COVID, where I finally had the space because of the lockdown, in the United States during the pandemic. I finally had the space to really see some of my more fraught relationships for what they were and how they stood out differently than my other relationships. And my mother was certainly one of those relationships. So I ended up screaming at her through a Zoom call and really having a hard time with that. And for the first time, asking myself, what is going on here? I don't scream at people. Why is this happening? And I revisited the idea that my mother might have borderline. And I got this book called Understanding the Borderline Mother by Dr. Christine Ann Lawson. And that's really when my world blew open in regards to understanding my childhood trauma. And like you said, there was a blueprint for my toxic family system and the tragedy that had seemed to befall us at every corner. And it was very structurally in line with a subtype of borderline called the witch. So when I saw that my mother also was likely to be the subtype called the witch, the two together really, it was so shocking to me at that point, that epiphany. I really probably sat there and stared at a wall for a day, just how could this be possible? But it was. And, I think sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
Yes.
And it basically, for me, that was the turning point in the relationship with my mother, because when I started reading about the severity of possible condition, I realized that, I had to get out of this for my own mental health and for my sister's own mental health. And ultimately we did. And we went no contact with my parents, which was an incredibly painful thing to do. But as you said, it is in some sort, we all have to have our own individuation.
Yeah, we do.
At some point.
Yeah, yeah. What's fascinating to me is one of my most recent interviews, Dr. Erica Elliott, a beautiful, beautiful interview and beautiful, wonderful woman with a fascinating story. She talks about her narcissistic mother as well, on a much, I think, smaller scale than yours. And her difficult childhood with this mother who was very rough on her and the whole family. And Erica beautifully talks about this moment when she had an epiphany and she understood that her mother was actually just a wounded child like she was. And for the first time in her life, she went over to her mom and she told her, "I love you," which in her family, nobody ever said to anybody. And her mom started crying. She was so deeply moved in this blueprint. This just kicked her out of her own position, that this resulted in a big healing for the mom and for their relationship and for the whole family, which was fascinating. I want to talk about how, yes, sometimes that can happen. But I have a beautiful quote from your own book where you're like, you had this moment where your mom, where you said, where is it? I can't find it. But the same thing, you sat down with your mom and you said, "I love you. I'm here for you, understand you, understand where you're coming from. I accept your magic," and so on. But nothing changed. I just want to put this out there that each experience is so individual and there's no recipes and no right and wrong. And we just do the best we can.
That's absolutely right. And I think that is part of the heartbreak I wanted to convey in my book. And one thing that people say quite often is, "Why did you keep going back?" And, when I read the book, I'm cheering, like, "Get out of there, just stop, walk away." And there was this happy ending that I was seeking over and over again because I refused to believe it wasn't going to have a happy ending.
Yeah.
Even in the glass castle, there's a happy ending. And I really wanted it to end that way. But ultimately, for some of us, it just doesn't. And the happy ending, I kind of say in the book where I ask my therapist, "Where's the happy ending?" And she's like, "This is the happy ending.
This is the happy ending," but it is. Yeah. What about mothering yourself? We talk a lot about this in this podcast, and I do Thank You Mama creative writing workshops where at the end of the workshops, we decide what of our mother's lessons we want to take with us, what we want to reject, but also what can we do for ourselves? How can we mother ourselves? And you mentioned that in the book as well at one point. Have you worked with that? Do you have any experiences with giving yourself what your mother wasn't able to?
Yes. And I do think that it's my life's work, if you believe in a soul path. And I had a psychic tell me as much. But I am a Jungian depth coach now. So I work with people in the Jungian framework, psychological framework. And it's been hugely helpful for me because of the idea of the mother archetype that lives within us. And this is so beautiful and poignant for me because when I can uncover, what Jung calls the shadow, these negative aspects that get repressed into the unconscious, they can really attach to your archetypes, that which within you is eternal and fixed and pure, and kind of cover them over. So when you have what he calls a negative mother or negative mother experience, your mother archetype is going to be colored as that, unless you do the work to pull that human experience off of it. And then what is underneath, and you can access this through active imagination, meditation, and just work on yourself is a pure mother archetype. And for those of us who have had very extreme situations with our mothers and lack of love and maybe some pretty disturbing behavior, it's very important to do this work. And I found that focusing on some type of figure like the Virgin Mary, or, you can pick whatever in your tradition, spiritual tradition, doesn't have to be spiritual, but some type of archetype to affix that mother to is helpful. Because it really does start individuating, like you said, from your human mother.
Yeah.
That so that you can really uncover that maternal energy within yourself.
But I want to expand on this from the person who had a wonderful and quite a present mother. We also need to learn to find this internal mother, because when we lose these mothers that we are so used to being there for us, we think we are left alone. And it was my journey to understand that I'm not alone. I do have my mother inside of me in whatever shape or form. And so it is also my task as well, and has been for the last 8 years, to, as you say, uncover this mother archetype inside of me. And when times get rough, to stand up for myself, to mother myself, and to allow myself, not think just because my mother is not here anymore, that mother figure is not here anymore. So it's a fascinating task we all have to do.
Absolutely. And it does also need to happen with the father archetype as well.
Yes.
Because they're two halves of a whole.
Yeah.
And these are things that we do have to find within ourselves. And it's, the good news is it's there.
It's there.
It's there.
We just have to trust it and find it. And dare finding it. Pull the cover of it.
Yeah.
Orenda, so many things I'd like to ask you. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your music. And it was your mother who actually started your life with music, because she gave you a guitar at the age of 15, or were you younger? Can you shortly just tell me about it? Because it's a beautiful journey. And I'd like to know also if you are still, as far as I understand, currently you are writing mostly, or are you still working with music? Just tell me a little bit about your music.
Okay, yeah. So, ironically, my mother is the one that gave me a guitar when I was 15. And that did end up being the, quote unquote, the ticket out. The ticket out of the small town and the family system, which we were very poor, growing up. And so I had to get creative of how I was going to kind of move out of the situation. And I thought it was going to be academics, but it ultimately ended up being a rock band, very unlikely for, Birmingham, Alabama in the 90s. But I formed a band in high school with my long time now musical partner, Maria Taylor. And we just really formed a friendship and a musical bond that continued on for, 30 years. So I call it part ambition and really just obsession, and part luck. But, we got signed to Geffen Records when we were very young, and then we went on to have a pretty, I'd say, at least critically acclaimed independent career as the band Azure Ray. And up until very recently, I'm still touring and playing with bands. I took a hiatus to work on the book and promote it. And I do think I've kind of been bitten by the writing bug a little bit more.
We're lucky. The readers will be happy.
But also, I'm 48, and for me, it's like I don't really want to be riding around in a 15-passenger van anymore, going around the country. So I feel like I'm transitioning into writing as a creative art form, and it suits me. For like I said, I moved to the desert 5 years ago. Seems like my heart is calling me to kind of slow down and pull inward.
let's jump back to mom. Let's introduce her a little bit, because I always talk about mom's life a little bit so we can understand the constellation and the lessons. Can you tell me a little bit shortly about her life and where she's coming from?
She grew up in a small area near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, called Wyndham Springs, very rural, and from poor farming community. And from what I understand, had a pretty tumultuous childhood herself. Her father was an alcoholic and verbally and physically abusive to her mother. There is allegations of sexual abuse, but interestingly, detail it in the book, her own brother disputes this.
Okay.
And she had a choice when she graduated high school. Her mother said, you can get a nose job or you can get a bus ticket to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And she chose the bus ticket to New York City and met my father there. But interestingly, came right back to the South when she got pregnant with my older sister. And then when she was pregnant with me, she moved them back to the South, back to the farm, essentially, the farm that she grew up on. And there is a diary that I also mentioned in the book that details that time. And I received the diary, I don't know, over a decade ago, I think. And what struck me about it was that she was very mentally ill, even at that time, even when I was 3 years old. And it's kind of fascinating. It's like, oh, how do I know this? I have it literally written down in her own words. And so, I would really describe my mother as tortured, mentally ill, eccentric, artistic, passionate, a fighter. But the problem is, I think she had so many demons, she was fighting against everyone. She's a very strong woman in some ways, a very weak woman in some ways. And these are all, I think, people can relate of extreme borderline narcissistic personalities. They can be very charming, very exciting, but also there's this volatility that you live with, and especially as a child, it can be very frightening. I think she frightens my father too, honestly.
Who is still at her side through all these years and all these experiences. He's been kind of a quiet supporter. Yep.
He's what you would call a codependent. So yeah, that's I guess that's in a nutshell how I describe her.
Okay. Good. Now we heard about mom and we heard about you and we heard about the book. Have you thought about lessons? Because this podcast is all about lessons we learn. And you and I were writing before this interview, and I said, yes, we can also learn through negative ways or experiences.
Absolutely.
Do you have lessons you feel you learned from her through all of this?
Oh, absolutely. Because even though there's been a lot of trauma and pain, no one is all bad or all good.
I have this quote here as well. I love it.
Yeah. So one thing that I learned from my mother is that creating art is a priceless form of catharsis and self-expression, especially for those who aren't able to access it in a conscious way. But also, you want to be careful not to use it as a mask to hide behind, because you still need to do the work. Yeah. And I learned both of those things from my mother. I learned magical thinking from my mother.
Okay.
And I'm very grateful for that. She gave me a very magical lens through which to see the world.
Yeah.
And I cherish that. And I think that's what drew me to Jung's work as well.
What happened to all this paranormal, I would say, I don't know how else to call them, or magical things that were happening, where the doors were slamming in that one house that was haunted, and then her little potions and revenges and so on. Do you think there was something to it? I mean, it kind of, reading the book, it hangs in the, you don't give an opinion. It's like, so what happened to those things?
I mean, I don't give an opinion because I'm right where the reader is.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
I do know that I've experienced certainly things in my life that I can't explain, so
Yeah.
I don't discount. But I also know that my mother fabricated a lot of her stories.
So we don't know.
We don't know.
It is what you make out of it.
That's right.
Sorry, I interrupted you. So we had magical thinking.
Mm-hmm. And I think on a more practical side is I learned if the people you love are asking you to get help.
Yeah.
Just
that's important.
Yes, it is. It is vitally important that we fight that urge to deny that there might be something wrong with us or broken in us to the detriment of our closest and most important relationships.
Oof, those are 3 very, very deep lessons. And then for the end, for my interviews, a very important question as well. What do you wish she had taught you? Is there anything like, oh, I wish my mom had taught me this?
Yes, I would say, and I think the children of parents with narcissistic personality styles will also relate to this, but there emerges from childhood trauma a real lack of self-esteem and sense of safety. It's an existential sense of safety that's really lacking. And I really wish that I had been taught that had been fostered within me. These are the things that you kind of feel childhood trauma survivors that have been robbed from you. And I think it actually has a lot to do with nurturing that mother archetype within yourself, so that you can start to foster and cultivate this. Which is I work on every day. But that's probably the biggest thing that I wish that she had taught me.
Orenda, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. Is there anything I forgot to ask you, or anything you would like to anything else you'd like to mention?
This has just been a great conversation, and thank you for your insight and depth. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And we are going to put your website in the episode notes so my listeners can find you, and how to find your book as well, which I'm really highly recommending to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Orenda, good luck with everything. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyouMama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.